Okay, so what is a macro? Really, a macro is it's sort of analogous to a miniature program built inside of Excel that is made to actually interact with Excel to either make formatting changes or complex calculations and things like that. And so, one of the big things you'll see macros used a lot for is whenever there is a static process, say a report that has to be run maybe once a week or something like that. A macro might be built to format that report so that a company doesn't have to pay somebody to spend an hour formatting a report when a macro could just do it all in a minute or something. And so that's one of the ways. I guess really kind of a broader term for that would just be automation, right? Macros are used for automation, and among other things. And so in order to create a macro, you would have to know how to use VBA, which stands for Visual Basic for Applications, and it's basically a sub-language. It's just a programming syntax that's used inside of Excel. It's also used inside of Microsoft Access for building databases. And so if you ever wanted just to see what code looks like in a macro, if you had a macro, you could go, like I have this one open here, and if I wanted to look at the code for this, I could go to my View tab. You can also do this through the Developer tab if you have that. If you don't have the Developer tab, you can just go to View and then go to your macros here, and if you click on just the regular macro button, this gives you a list of all the macros in all of the open workbooks that you have currently. And so I have two different workbooks with macros, and so in this particular workbook I have this first macro and this last macro here. And so if I wanted to look at the code, I could just click this step into or this edit button while I'm highlighting the macro I'm interested in. And so that'll take me in, and you can see just kind of a bunch of mumbo jumbo here. And this is, obviously you wouldn't really want to mess with this, which is kind of interesting to see, and you can build macros right into sheets, so into the actual sheets that you see down here. Or you can, insert a module and build a macro that way. And then there's a bunch of other things that you can do here in this Excel code view. But we're not going to really delve too deeply into that. But there's a couple different ways you might run across a macro. And so in the case of this one here, I don't really have any data for this. I guess we could just make some just to run it real quick. This is a macro that actually runs regression. And kind of the handy thing about this particular macro is that it allows regression for an unlimited number of, well, not really unlimited, but for a very large number of independent variables, up to probably about 80 independent variables. And so if you had some data here in this particular macro, you could then use these buttons. And so if I wanted to just run regression on that, I can just click here, and it's going to give me this warning, and I'll say yes, and then it's just going to give me the output from that regression. And so that's one way you'll see macros is through these buttons. And if I wanted to, I could actually look at these by going to my Developer tab and go into my Design mode here. And when I do that, I can then click on these. When I click on these buttons now, they won't actually initiate the macro. And then I can double click, and it'll take me right into the code for that particular button. So that's kind of an interesting feature there. So that's one way to look at a macro. Another way is I just kind of threw together this simple one over here. Sometimes you might see a macro like this, and so this will tell you, kind of some instructions. Open your macro file and your data file. Obviously instructions would hopefully be more specific than this in the real world, but in this case, if you watch the pivot table video, you'll remember that we had this data over here. And so in this case, with this macro, it's telling us to open the macro file and also the data file, which in this case we're just going to use that pivot table data. And then we're going to select the data file's source data sheet so that it is the active sheet. And what we mean by that is just that we're going to be looking at that particular pivot table data whenever we run the macro. And in this case, to run the macro, we just press Control-D. And so the way that you set that up, if we go back here to macro button, again, we can do that through our Developer tab or through our View tab. We have a list of macros. In this case, we're looking at this data format macro here. And if I go to my options down here, you can see that the shortcut key here has been set to Control+D. And so you can do that yourself if you have a macro and you want a shortcut key. And so that means that anytime, as long as this workbook is open, anytime I press Control D, no matter where I'm at on my computer, whatever I'm looking at in Excel or anything, if I push Control D, it's going to initiate this macro, and it's going to initiate it on whatever worksheet I'm currently looking at. Okay, so if I go over here, well, I've still got this open. If I go over here to my data, and so in this case, it's just kind of a this basic hypothetical situation where we're going to assume that each of these dates are really just dates in the month of January, and that the numbers within these dates are analogous to days. So, you know, this would be January 1st, this would be January 2nd, this would be the 3rd, so forth. And so we just kind of want to reformat the data to show that. And so that's what that macro is built to do. And so I'm just going to press Control D here. And as you can see, it just automatically changed all those dates to look like actual dates. And that goes all the way down to the bottom. And so that's just an example of an extremely simple formatting macro. And in the real world, if you ever end up somewhere where they actually use a lot of Excel, you'll probably see some pretty crazy formatting macros, some of which might take several minutes, maybe even longer to run. But this one just obviously is really simple. So anyway, that's just kind of a quick introduction to macros. And if there are any questions, if anyone wants to delve more deeply into that, just let me know, and we can make some further videos or get together and discuss that.